Hello and welcome back. I hope everyone is healthy, doing well, and managing in these uncertain times. Today we're beginning a new unit on the relationship between the economy and culture. We're going to think about how economic questions and economic activity are not just questions of numbers and percentages, but are also cultural questions and moral questions, and how economies are shaped by culture. People usually tend to think of the economy as an abstract entity that exists outside of any cultural context. This is especially true right now, unfortunately, if you've been watching the news, where certain politicians and Wall Street bankers are arguing that we should disregard our health and get life back to normal as quickly as possible for the sake of the economy, which is completely crazy. Nevertheless, we often think of economies in the form of statistics, employment and unemployment figures, stock markets, supply and demand, GDP, etc. Yet, importantly, economies also have cultural foundations. One feature that is central to all economies is the act of exchange. This may seem obvious, however, there are three major categories of exchange that are found in many, if not all, different economic systems. And these three categories shape the cultural foundations of different economies. What are those three things? Oh, well, thanks for asking. The three types of exchange are market exchange, redistribution, and reciprocity. That's market exchange, redistribution, and reciprocity. Remember, before we move on, these three types of exchange are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We usually find some combination of these three categories in different economies, in different societies. But these are important models for understanding different kinds of economic systems. So what are these three types of exchange? Let's find out. Market exchange is the form of exchange where goods and services are bought and sold. In other words, goods and services are traded in exchange for money, usually money. Could be Bitcoin or gold, usually money. I go to the coffee shop, I give the person at the cash register $2, and that person gives me a cup of coffee or a bagel or whatever. The goods that are bought and sold in market exchange, the bagel, the coffee, these are called commodities. And importantly, the economic interactions in market exchange are depersonalized. This means that there are no social bonds created between the people who are doing the exchange in market exchange. If I go back to the coffee shop tomorrow and there's a different person behind the cash register, it doesn't matter. Who cares? The only thing that matters is the commodity that is being exchanged for the money. The second type of exchange is called redistribution. Redistribution is where goods or money are collected into a central fund by a central authority and are then reallocated by that central authority within the group that it collected from. What is an example of redistribution? Now, in the past, when I've asked that question, some students answer by saying socialism. Socialism is actually a very bad answer to this question because the fact is we find redistribution in many different economies, including in capitalist market economies, as well as in pre-capitalist economies, as we're going to see. Taxes are one obvious example of redistribution, but taxes are not the only example of redistribution. We also find examples of redistribution in pre-capitalist systems. For example, in hunter-gatherer societies, like those of the Kong of Southern Africa, who we read about earlier in the semester. In those societies, we find systems of community-wide distribution of meat and of other foods that are done by some central authority figure in that society. Another example of redistribution in a pre-capitalist society is the potlatch. Make a note of that because we'll be discussing that shortly, and I strongly recommend that you read the article about that that's up on Blackboard. Market, exchange, and redistribution are not mutually exclusive. We always find some form of redistribution in market-based societies. In fact, market-based societies would completely collapse without systems of redistribution. Without taxes, there would be no roads, no bridges, no highways, no schools, police, or firefighters, just to name a few things. None of these things would exist if there were no mechanisms of redistribution in a capitalist society. The third form of exchange is called reciprocity or reciprocal exchange. What is reciprocity? Reciprocity is the exchange of resources, of goods, or of services done as a way of creating and reinforcing lasting social bonds between individuals and between groups of people. It's a way of exchanging things that creates lasting social bonds. It involves a mutual give and take between people, usually over a very long period of time. Reciprocity is generally based on the exchange of gifts. What is the difference between a gift and a commodity? Think about that. We'll be answering that question as we go along, but I want you to think about that. Within the category of reciprocity, there are three types of reciprocal exchange: generalized reciprocity, balanced reciprocity, and negative reciprocity. Generalized reciprocity is where there is a close relationship between the people who are exchanging things. And what those people are exchanging in generalized reciprocity is usually classified as gifts, as a gift. When people exchange gifts, there are three important things to keep in mind. First, the value of the gift that is given is usually not calculated in advance by the person who is giving the gift. The person who's giving the gift does not calculate the value of the gift or its price before they give the gift. Second, what is given back as a gift is also usually not predetermined in advance. You don't expect a certain thing back after you give someone a gift. And third, and most importantly, when someone gives a gift, they do not expect an immediate return. They expect some kind of return in the future, but they do not expect that return to be immediate. Giving gifts, especially birthday gifts, presents, doing favors between friends, or getting financial help from your parents are all some examples of generalized reciprocity in our own society. In other societies, generalized reciprocity often takes the form of long-term trade partnerships between individuals or between groups of people. We see one example of this in the chapter by Cronk titled Reciprocity and the Power of Giving. Cronk writes about the Kong system of trade called Hexaro, not quite sure how to pronounce it, Hxaro. Hexaro is where people form trading relationships, taking turns, giving things to each other over many years. In this system of trade, importantly, people never calculate the exact exchange values of the things that are being traded, of the things that are being given and then given back. When someone gives their trading partner a gift, they expect to get a return gift at some time in the future from that person, but they do not calculate and they do not expect that the gift will be of a specific value or of a specific price. The Kung explained this system by saying, we don't trade with things, we trade with people, meaning that the social relationships created through this system of Hexaro reciprocal exchange are just as important, if not more important, than the material goods that are being exchanged between the people in this trading partnership. This is an important point because this is true for most systems of generalized reciprocal exchange, that the social relationship is as important or more important than the material goods that are being exchanged. But this point is not necessarily true for our second example of reciprocal exchange, which is balanced reciprocity. In balanced reciprocity, the trading relationship is less personal and is usually more institutionalized than what we find in generalized reciprocity. There is usually a direct and simultaneous exchange of goods, meaning I give you something and you give me something back right away. And in balanced reciprocity, people pay more attention to the exact value of the things that are being exchanged. Also in balanced reciprocity, the sense of indebtedness is more openly acknowledged than what we find in generalized reciprocity. In our own society, giving gifts on Christmas is one example of balanced reciprocity. If you don't celebrate Christmas, just imagine for a second that you do. What we find when we give gifts on Christmas, the exchange of gifts is immediate. Everyone exchanges the gifts right there in front of each other's faces. And the value of the gifts that are given tends to be roughly equal. Of course, there can be exceptions to that. But just imagine for a second, imagine you gave your sibling as a Christmas gift a new iPhone 7, and your sibling gave you back in return a $5 gift card to Starbucks. You probably wouldn't be too happy about that. There might be a little friction there in your relationship with your sibling, right? Because in that case, the exchange would be very unbalanced. In other societies, balanced reciprocity with the immediate exchange of gifts of roughly equal value is often done to create alliances between two groups or as a kind of peace treaty between groups that had been previously feuding. So just to review the differences between generalized reciprocity and balanced reciprocity, in generalized reciprocity, the exchange is not immediate. I give you something, now you give me something back in the future, whereas in balanced reciprocity, the exchange is direct and immediate. In generalized reciprocity, the value of the things exchanged is de-emphasized, it's less important or not important, whereas in balanced reciprocity, the value of the things exchanged is of more importance because it's more important that the value of the things exchanged be of equal value in balanced reciprocity. And in generalized reciprocity, the sense of indebtedness, the sense that I owe you something in the future for what you've given me, is also de-emphasized. This is not usually openly acknowledged, whereas in balanced reciprocity, the sense of indebtedness is openly acknowledged between the people who are trading things. So both balanced reciprocity and generalized reciprocity work in different ways to create and maintain social relationships between people. That's not quite the case, however, with our third example of reciprocal exchange, which is negative reciprocity. In negative reciprocity, one or both sides to an exchange try to gain the most while giving away the least. In other words, each side of the exchange tries to get back more than what they gave. Negative reciprocity is more likely to occur between strangers or people who don't know each other very well, or between groups that are otherwise hostile towards one another. And negative reciprocity is often accompanied by hard bargaining, by deceit or dishonesty, or even, in the most extreme cases, by violence and aggression, like forcing people to pay tribute to a ruler. And importantly, there are no lasting social relationships between people engaged in negative reciprocity. So negative reciprocity, in many ways, more closely resembles market exchange than it does the other types of reciprocity. Negative reciprocity also sometimes overlaps with another system of exchange that you may have been wondering about until now, which is called barter. Barter is the exchange of goods for other types of goods or services where no money is involved in the exchange. However, barter is closer to market exchange than to either generalized or balanced reciprocity. In fact, barter exists on a spectrum somewhere between market exchange and negative reciprocity. With barter, the transaction is immediate. I give you something and you give me something back right away. But unlike with balanced reciprocity, barter is not focused on creating lasting social bonds between the two parties in the exchange. So barter is very different from reciprocal exchange in that respect. As I mentioned before, generalized reciprocity involves the exchange of gifts. Gifts help create lasting social relationships by establishing mutual obligations between people who are involved in exchange. Now, it's a cliche in our own society to say that it is better to give than to receive. And while the gifts given in systems of generalized reciprocity are often thought of as acts of pure altruism, you're just giving for the sake of giving because giving is good, the fact is that gifts almost everywhere almost always come with some strings attached. Because when giving the gift, the giver almost always expects something in return at some point in the future. The fact is that gifts are never purely altruistic, but usually come with some strings attached to them. Why is this the case? Take an example from hunter-gatherer societies, like the Kung of Southern Africa, studied by Richard Lee, who we've read about before. For the Kung, meat that is distributed by successful hunters is given out to the people in their community as a public gift. And as we learned from Lee's article, Bushman hunters who are successful don't like to boast or brag about how successful they are. However, the successful hunter does expect, when he distributes the results of his hunt, a reciprocal gift in the future when other men return from a successful hunt, right? By giving out meat as a gift, the hunter gains honor and he gains prestige as the supplier of an important resource for their community. This prestige obligates others to give back to him in the future. These obligations created by the gift constitute a form of power that the giver has over other people in that society who he is giving the gifts to. Even in our own society, when someone gives a gift, there is usually an implied expectation of a return gift at some point in the future. At this point, we can return to an earlier question: what is the difference between a gift and a commodity? Obviously, every commodity has a price, whereas when we give a gift, we usually take the price tag off of it, since it's assumed that a gift should not have a price. However, there is one less obvious difference between a gift and a commodity. One significant difference between gifts and commodities is that, unlike with transactions involving commodities, repaying the gift must be deferred into the future. Think about our earlier example of market exchange. When I go to the coffee shop to get my bagel, I can't say to them, "I'll pay you tomorrow." You have to pay for your bagel right there and then. The exchange is immediate, or it doesn't happen at all. You can't say, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a cheeseburger today." That doesn't work in the real world. It didn't even work in the Popeye cartoon. Not sure you guys get that reference. Anyway, it is exactly the opposite with gift exchange. If you give a friend a gift, you would not expect them to run out and immediately get you a gift in return. That would actually be kind of weird. Why is an immediate return of the gift weird? Because it makes the exchange look and feel more like an exchange of commodities than like the giving of a gift. Immediate return of the gift implies that the social relationship the gift is hoping to create or maintain will not be a long-lasting one. An immediate return of the gift says that the person you gave the gift to wants to cut the ties between you and them rather than extend those ties into the future. The larger point here is that reciprocity and reciprocal gift giving follow social rules and cultural norms, and the delayed return of the gift, you can't just immediately give another gift back in return. You have to wait. This is one example of those cultural rules. The most famous work in anthropology on gifts in non-Western societies is called, appropriately enough, The Gift, by the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, chapters of which are up on Blackboard for your reading pleasure. Mauss is not just another famous dead white guy. He was also the nephew of the eminent French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who we talked about in the previous lecture. In this book, The Gift, which is a comparative ethnography along the lines of the book by Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger, which we talked about earlier in the class, this book, as a comparative ethnography, is based on the research of many different scholars, and in it, Mauss identifies a cultural logic to gift giving in non-Western societies, with economies based primarily on reciprocal exchange. Mauss begins with the following argument. In Western culture, he says, we tend to think of gifts as voluntary, as disinterested, and as spontaneous. Voluntary, meaning we think giving gifts is optional and up to the choice of the individual. I do what I want. Disinterested, meaning we think we give gifts without having any personal interest in doing so, no personal interest in giving gifts to other people. And spontaneous, meaning that we give gifts whenever we feel like it and not in response to social rules or social norms. Mauss then argues that, in fact, none of these three things are true. In the West or anywhere else, Mauss argues that gift giving is mandatory, that it is highly interested and calculated towards receiving a return gift in the future, and that it is not spontaneous, but that it follows specific rules. The central question that Mauss then asked was this: what is it about the gift that makes people feel compelled to give something back of equal or greater value in return? And he looked especially in non-Western societies with economies based on gift exchange. Mauss's answer to that question was that the gift contains something, a kind of spiritual power or psychological force, if you will, that compels a person who receives a gift to either return it or pass it on to someone else. Looking specifically at the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, Mauss found that the Maori had a name for this spiritual force. They called it the hau, H-A-U, of the gift. The hau is a spiritual or perhaps psychological force that compels a person to repay a gift. And it can cause harm if a person who receives a gift fails to return another gift in the future. For the Maori in New Zealand, when someone gives you a gift, you in turn give it to a third person, and that third person then eventually gives something back to you. This happens not necessarily because you want it to happen, but because you are forced to do so by the hau of the gift, this spiritual force that is in the gift. So according to this cultural logic, gifts are not simply objects of exchange, but they are extensions of the self that symbolically contain a part of the self of the person who is giving the gift. In other words, this exchange of things is actually an exchange of selves, and this exchange of selves creates bonds, lasting bonds between people. The implications for the individual, if they fail to return a gift, is that the how of the gift, the HAU of the gift, will cause that person harm because the how comes in part from the person who gave the gift in the first place. It contains a part of their personhood. So in a culture based primarily on reciprocal gift exchange, in addition to not being purely altruistic, the gift is also potentially dangerous, because if you get a gift and you don't give a gift back in return, that can do you damage. Most tells us that when they receive a gift, the Maori believe that, as he puts it, to keep this thing is dangerous, not only because it is illicit to do so, but also because it comes morally, physically, and spiritually from a person, right? So the gift comes, it's not just a physical thing, but it's also a moral thing and a spiritual thing. This is the larger important point here in everything that Mauss is arguing. In societies where the economy is not dominated by the depersonalized transactions of market exchange, gift giving involves more than an exchange of just physical objects, and even more than just the creation and maintenance of social bonds, which is the larger point of generalized reciprocity. Reciprocal gift exchange in these societies also has a spiritual dimension, and most importantly, it has a moral dimension. And both of these things, the spiritual dimension and the moral dimension, help create and maintain social bonds within society. Mauss then discusses the three obligations of the gift. The three obligations of the gift are the obligation to give, the obligation to receive, and the obligation to reciprocate. The first obligation is the obligation to give. Mauss tells us, in his words, to refuse to give or to fail to invite is the equivalent of a declaration of war. It is a refusal of friendship and a refusal of social intercourse. In other words, you must give gifts. To fail to do so, to fail to give gifts, would be a complete rejection of society. You have an obligation to give. The second obligation is the obligation to receive, which means that when someone gives you a gift, you cannot reject it. You must accept the gift when it is given to you. To either refuse to give or to refuse to receive a gift is to reject bonds of alliances, and again, it's just to reject society. Also important in the second obligation, if you refuse to accept a gift, this shows basically that you are afraid that you won't be able to give a gift back again in the future. This would mean that you lose prestige. This makes you look weak, and you would lose social standing in these societies. Finally, there is an obligation to reciprocate. What does this mean? It means that after you receive a gift, you must then give something back in return at some point in the future. If a person cannot do this, if you receive a gift and you cannot give a gift back again in the future, and importantly, that gift has to be of equal or greater value than the gift you received, then you lose prestige, and again, you lose standing in society. If a person cannot reciprocate at all with anything, in the worst case scenario, they could be made into the slave of the person who gave them the gift in the first place. The larger point here is that there is a morality to gift transactions. In systems of generalized reciprocity, the ultimate goal is both an economic one, but also, more importantly, a moral one. The goal is to promote harmony and cooperation between people and between groups of people. This helps to promote the overall cohesion of society. Gift transactions follow a specific cultural logic, and there are negative consequences when that cultural logic is violated. And significantly, notions of honor and of prestige in this kind of economic system are also very important. Notions of honor and of prestige are especially important in a system of exchange called the potlatch. A potlatch is discussed in detail in the reading by Marvin Harris that's up on Blackboard. What is a potlatch? A potlatch is a kind of competitive feast where the object is to either give away or to destroy as much wealth or more wealth than one's opponents. The system of exchange called potlatch was found among the Kwakiutl people and other neighboring indigenous groups of the Pacific Northwest of North America. You can see that's on the map where the Pacific Northwest is, and today what is Canada. Similar systems of exchange with different names, of course, are found across the Pacific in New Guinea and Indonesia and elsewhere. In a potlatch, the leader of a host group invited a rival group, or perhaps several rivals, as guests to a large communal feast. During this feast, the host then tried to give away as many valuable goods as he possibly could to the guests at his potlatch. The whole thing is called a potlatch. The valuable goods that he gave away included food, blankets, canoes, and valuable copper plates seen in the photo here. One extremely valuable copper plate could be worth the equivalent of up to 1,000 blankets. So in a potlatch, a host, who is also a local political leader, throws a big party, and during this party tries to give away as many gifts as he can to his guests. Why do this? Were people just crazy about giving things away for no reason? No. The object of the potlatch was to show that the host chief was more entitled to the status of chief, to the status of political leader, and that therefore he deserved a higher status than his guests, who therefore did not deserve to be considered as political leaders. Under the logic of the potlatch, the person who can give away the most was the person who was considered the most legitimate political leader. Because whoever could give away the greatest number of gifts gained the highest amount of prestige, and prestige, the admiration of other people, was what allowed a person to become a political leader. So potlatch was a kind of weaponized gift giving. After a host held a potlatch, the guests would then go home and then would prepare to hold another return potlatch for the host at some point in the future. During this second potlatch, the leader of the guest group of the first potlatch would try to prove that he was greater than his former host. He did that by trying to give away even more valuable gifts than he had received during the first potlatch. You can see that in the potlatch, economic exchange was inseparable from politics, and political rank between groups, in other words, political leadership, was determined by how much a leader could give away. Most tells us that the word potlatch originally meant to nourish or to consume. Others say that the word means to flatten, and the goal of the potlatch was indeed to flatten your opponent. If you could bury your rival with the amount of gifts that you could give them, then you were considered to be the most important political leader. So here's a question for you. Of the three types of exchange system that we discussed at the beginning, market, redistribution, and reciprocity, what type of exchange system would you classify the potlatch as? As an economic system, potlatch is a combination of redistribution and reciprocal exchange. Reciprocal exchange because when someone holds a potlatch for you, you have to give one back for them again in the future. And also redistribution because valuable goods are being redistributed, first from host to guest, and then from the guest chief to his followers in his community. As a system of reciprocity, potlatch has elements of both balanced reciprocity, but also negative reciprocity. Why negative reciprocity? Because in a potlatch, valuable goods were not only given away by the host, but they could also be destroyed. Competitive giving sometimes became a process of competitive destruction. A chief could, as Mose describes it for us, put his slaves to death, burn his precious oil, throw his valuable copper pieces into the sea, and set his house on fire. Now, why would a chief destroy his valuable objects? This was done in part as a religious sacrifice made as an offering up to the gods or the spirits. Remember, sacrifice is an act of destruction as you hand something over to a higher power. So, like with the how of the gift, there is also a religious element to the potlatch as well. But the host of a potlatch would also destroy his valuables as part of an economic and political strategy, because once a host destroyed his own valuables, his rivals were compelled by the logic of reciprocal exchange to then destroy their own valuables in the future. If a host during a potlatch burned his own house down, a rival chief would have to burn his house down later, or else the rival chief would lose prestige and would most likely not be considered a political leader. Now, the Pacific Northwest is a temperate rainforest, so there are a lot of trees around. So if a chief did burn his house down, he'd just get his followers to help him build a new one. No big deal, right? But it's still a pretty baller move. I'm going to stop there for now. We're going to continue this discussion in the next lecture. Please email me if you have any questions, and stay safe, stay healthy, and stay indoors. See you next time.